Wasn't that beautiful? That is Angelica. That is Angelica Biltà by Francesco Ludini in the 14th century, one of the earliest pieces of polyphonic music that Kevin, our music director, could find close to St. Francis's era. Please, a warm round of applause for Beth Noble, our soloist, and Kevin Kokel, our organist. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our grand finale monthly Cloud of Witnesses program. We hope you will find this evening to be an incredible program to welcome in the season of Advent. Tonight and tomorrow, Bill Cook, our guest speaker, will present St. Francis of Assisi in 3 segments. By the way, St. Francis is in the stained glass window to the right of the altar at Christ's crucifixion. You'll learn more about that from Bill a bit later on. Tonight's talk will be on the life and times of St. Francis. Tomorrow's talk will be broken into 2 segments. The first part of the morning, Bill will inform us about St. Francis in art, the beginning of Italian Renaissance painting under the influence of St. Francis. In the later morning, he will talk about what it means to imitate St. Francis in the 21st century. Remember, for those of you who registered for tomorrow morning, we have Holy Mass at 8 o'clock, breakfast from 8 until 9 o'clock, and our talk begins at 9 o'clock sharp. We'll have a little more time between Mass and audiovisual setup. You should have received an agenda downstairs when you arrived. Bill's resume is attached to that. After the talk tonight, we'll take some questions, and then Father will lead us in a blessing, and then we will celebrate the conclusion of our Cloud of Witnesses program with an Italian-themed cocktail party prepared by European caterers. Italian wines from Umbria, after all, Assisi is in Umbria, Italian beer, Negronis, and Bellinis as well. I would like to thank Father Joe and Father Derek, if he's watching, and all our staff, Deacon Phil, Julia, Kim, Robin, and Paul, for their incredible support and tireless help with this 24-month-long program. As well, a huge thanks to all our parishioners and non-parishioners who volunteered to do all the research on one or more of our 24 saints, giving enlightening presentations on these holy people. A list of these moderators and all the saints are presented and are attached to your agenda. If you missed some of them, all but one of these were videotaped and can be found on our YouTube channel using the YouTube link found on our webpage. That's a lot of YouTubes. We have been blessed with so many volunteers who regularly helped with shopping, prepping, cooking, setup, and cleaning. Jeannie and John Walla, Pamela and Craig Mackey, Linda Wildman, Tony Bell, Ines Vergara, Maria Liuzzi, Mary Ellen Seacrest, Karen Cribbs, Mary Hirsch, Laura Pearson, Paula Douglas, Mona and Chad Klinger, and Mary Lee Foley, and all of you who routinely helped clean up after the meal each month. So a round of applause to you all. Now, about Bill Cook. I've known Bill, one of my favorite octogenarians, for almost 20 years, and have been so blessed to hear him speak many times on medieval and Renaissance history and art, both in Italy and France, and in numerous places in the US, including right here at the Aspen Institute. Born in Indianapolis, Bill graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Wabash College in history and received his PhD from Cornell University in medieval history, which included an academic year abroad doing research on medieval history in Prague, Vienna, and Oxford. For 42 years, he was a professor of history at State University of New York in Geneseo. Bill has been a recipient of numerous teaching honors over the years. He has published 5 books, including Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty and Humility, which we have made available for you for a small donation. He has been a visiting lecturer and presenter in 38 states and in over 20 countries, and has made 9 videos for the Great Courses. Now retired from academia, Bill has founded the Bill Cook Foundation, which has raised and distributed more than $2.5 million to schools and other educational programs in almost 40 countries on 5 continents, helping the poorest of children on this planet to pay for education. Raised an Episcopalian, Bill entered the Roman Catholic Church in 1975. Though never married, he is an adoptive father of 3 sons, residential guardian for 9 other young men, grandfather of 5, and great-grandfather of 1. Please, let's warmly welcome Bill Cook.
What a joy to be back in Aspen. And I first want to thank the parishioners. I want to thank Father Joe, and especially Ann, my old buddy. And I don't think either one of us is too offended by the word old in our case. And it's just such a pleasure to be back here. I've come fairly often, and then, of course, the pandemic sort of cut off everything. So this is my first attempt to fly in, a successful one, I'm proud to say, in about 5 years. I hope to come back, given the fact I'll be 80 in a while, I hope to come back pretty soon and talk to some more people about some more things. Francis of Assisi. I think before we talk about the life of Francis in some detail, it's important to say a little bit about the fact that, and I know this doesn't surprise anybody, the 13th century is not the 21st century, and Assisi is an aspen. And it's always very important to remember that, because I know as a historian, having read more term papers and essays than you want to imagine, that it's very hard for people to imagine themselves in a very different world, where ideas are different, institutions are different, behaviors are different, habits are different. And so I want to start with St. Francis in the 13th century. And that means I need to start with the 13th century. Francis was obviously born at the end of the 12th century. But let me just start with a little bit of medieval sociology, if that's not a term that scares people to death. I promise you I'll not make it a terror thing here. But at any rate, about 200 years before Francis was born, a monk in France wrote the first, I guess we would say, sociology of Europe. That there are three different groups of people in Europe, he wrote. Those who pray. Wait, we missed a picture here already. What happened here? There we go. Those who pray, and these are monks shown reading and singing around a book. Of course, books are all hand printed at that time, and therefore not everybody had his, or in the case of nuns, her own books. And so they had one great big book, and they all gathered around it. So this reminds us that according to this writer, who was himself a monk, the highest class of society were those who prayed. That meant the secular clergy, bishops, priests, and so on, but it especially meant monks. And there were monasteries really everywhere in Western Europe, and they had had a very bad time before the time of Francis, because Europe was attacked by a lot of non-Christians. And you want to go to where the loot is if you're a non-Christian. And the loot was in monasteries and convents, because people gave gold crosses, chalices, jeweled crosses, because they were acts of love and acts, of course, that hoped they would be helped along the way to heaven for their generosity to the church. And so monasteries were largely devastated. And so they were just making a comeback in the 11th and 12th century. By the way, who were those invaders? They came from every direction except the west, and they couldn't come from the west because you couldn't get there. They came from the north, the Vikings. The Vikings didn't just attack people right across from Norway or Sweden. For example, those Vikings rode those brilliant boats of theirs through the Straits of Gibraltar, into the Mediterranean, up the Tiber, and sacked Rome. You don't usually think of guys in the horned helmets sacking Rome, but they did. Then from the east came the Hungarians, and they had the best horsemen in Europe, and they came from the east. And then Muslims, who control all of North Africa at that time, came from the south. And by the way, a group of them also sacked Rome in the 9th century. So Europe was a dangerous place, and a lot of things that had once been stable, that had once been the beautiful glories of much of Western and Central Europe, were largely looted and destroyed. So Francis is still living in the 12th and 13th century in a rebuilding of European culture. But we all know, because we've had our ups and downs in history, rebuilding it doesn't mean making exactly the same as it was before. A, that's impossible, and B, it doesn't fit new circumstances. So Francis is really in an early period of a revival of culture in Western Europe that really began in the 12th century. I actually have one image out of whack here, and I have no idea why it is, so let me find it. The second group of people are those who fight. They're the knights, the warriors, the soldiers. the kings, the princes, and all those who valiantly defended, when they could, their own families, their own land, but also cities and churches and all the rest of it. This is an image from the 11th century that actually shows the conquest of England by the Normans. By the way, Normans is simply the word Norseman with S left out. Okay, they are Vikings. And then we have those who work. And as you can imagine, as in all societies, those who work are the great, great, great majority. And work meant essentially farming. Because, after all, this is the number one task, feeding all the people who live there. And so here's a medieval manuscript. You can see people cutting the crops. And this is the world into which Francis was born. Sort of. Because in Italy, something pretty brand new is happening at this time. And that is, well, guess what the Vikings do? They convert to Christianity. Guess what the Hungarians do? They convert to Christianity. Guess what the Muslims do? Except in Spain, they basically start fighting each other rather than attacking across the Mediterranean. So there was a kind of peace. And there is still some infrastructure left in Europe. Do you know the Romans built 58,000 miles of roads, for example? And they went to some of the darndest places. So there is a possibility, not just to try to recover what had been lost in those bad centuries, but also to build something new. And so, by the time of Francis, there's a new social class arising. Those who manufacture and sell things. And this shows a cloth merchant. Because now, if you want to get good cloth, since the seaways and landways are safer, you can go across the Alps from Italy to France to get them. And if that won't do, then hop in a boat and go to Constantinople and get them. And so Europe is opening up in the 12th century. And beginning with Italy, cities that existed in Roman times that had almost disappeared because of all the violence that was aimed at cities, now are beginning to rebuild. That's not just Rome, that's Florence, that's Milan, that's Venice, and a lot of other smaller cities, including a place named Assisi, which is in the region of Italy now that we call Umbria. So there's an old aristocracy, the knights, and there's sort of a new folks who have, well, a lot of money. And they too want to be recognized as part of society. They too want power. They too want opportunities to expand. So that sociology that I gave you, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, that pretty much describes it in 1,000, but it doesn't describe it during the lifetime of St. Francis, especially in Italy. And in fact, Francis was born of a merchant family, and not just any merchant family, but the Bernardoni family was the richest family in Assisi. Now that's being a big fish in a small pond, but nevertheless, that's what they were. We also need to remember that Assisi is not a new town, it's an old town. This is the main square of Assisi today. And if you look on the left side, you see something that looks an awful lot like the front of a Roman temple. That's because it's the front of a Roman temple. And it still dominates the main square of Assisi because Assisi actually is Assisium, which was a Roman city, medium size, but like almost every other Roman city, and therefore almost every city in Italy, there are ancient remains. So what's happening in Francis' time is something new is happening in a world this old. Sound familiar sometimes? Could describe other cultures. Ours comes to mind. This is Assisi. If you're going to be born in a pretty place, Assisi is not a bad choice. Mountains in the background, as you can see, the city spread out in the hill, and a castle up above. You always need to have a safe place to retreat with your wealth in case you're being attacked. Because we need to remember that maybe the Vikings and the Hungarians and the Muslims are gone, but guess who's still around? People from the next town that like to take some of your stuff and bring it back to their stuff. We all understand that, I think. So this is the world that Francis of Assisi was born in. Born to a merchant family, which was the sort of new aristocracy. But guess what? Even as a kid, he wasn't satisfied. He wanted to be part of the old aristocracy, the classy aristocracy. He wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to be a knight. And he had his chance because the city of Assisi went to war with the next city over, which is Perugia. And Francis went to fight for Assisi and ended up here for about a year. A Perugia dungeon, where, by the way, he probably got malaria, and that was probably what he died of at the age of 44. He spent a year there until his father could raise the money to ransom him. And he came home, and you know what he wanted to do? He wanted to be a knight. He wanted to play on a bigger stage. And the Pope was recruiting an army. Remember, the popes were landholders in Italy at this time. And Francis joins up, and he goes off to war. Something like this, probably. He's got the best horse, he's got the finest armor, because he's got the richest parents. And if he gets to be a knight, that'll be good for the family. They'll sort of be in a top position in two parts of the world. So here he is going off. He gets about 1 day away, and something happened. We don't know what it was. Whether it was a dream, a crisis, a kind of moral coming to grips with things, but something happened. And after 1 day, heading towards South Italy to fight, Francis came home. And he was beaten. This is a statue that was just put up a few years ago in front of the church where Francis is now buried. This is him coming home. He's still got all of his knightly things and his horse, but even the horse, you can see, is depressed. This just didn't work. And now, I guess to use probably the terms of people like his mother and father, Francis began to be weird. It doesn't seem very interested in the merchant side. And the war thing has now been a disaster. So what does he do? He kind of freaks out a bit. And one day, while he was walking out in the woods, probably humming or whatever he did, he ran across a leper. Lepers are not supposed to be out. Lepers live in what were called leprosaria, and they were only allowed out if they carried noisemakers and made noise so that everybody would know they were coming so people could flee from them. And a leper appeared to Francis. Maybe Francis just didn't hear him, we don't know. And Francis was appalled. And the leper was begging for money. Francis had that. So Francis, I think we can sort of picture this, probably from seeing the way people sometimes treat the people who are very poor, sort of dropped a coin in his hand, sort of hoping he wouldn't really touch him. Well, that's what merchants do. They're the money folks. That's what he could do. This profoundly affected him. And he tells us in his own writings, which are not very many, a few days later, he came across another leper, and he embraced him. This is a modern ceramic made in Assisi showing Francis embracing a leper. Francis was entering a new consciousness, a new world. not just a new spiritual world, but a new social world. And he tells us this. He said, after I embraced that leper, it was easy to leave the world. He didn't mean go live in a cave. He meant to leave the worldly values, the social structures, and all the rest of it. That leper made all the difference to Francis. In fact, for a while, he even lived at a leprosarium, helping to bandage their wounds. It was believed then that what is now called Hansen's disease was much more contagious than it really is. So what he was doing was something extraordinary, out of the ordinary, and you can imagine how mom and dad felt. He wasn't interested in business. He failed as a knight, and now he's hanging out with lepers. We can imagine that response. I want to show you a painting that was done only about 20 years after Francis died. This is two images of Francis with lepers. And on the left, you can see a leper is sitting on Francis's lap. And on the right, you can see he's taken the apron that's hanging up between the two figures, put it on, and is washing the feet of lepers. Now, if you saw that painting in the year it was made, 1245, you would very easily, without any art history courses, know that on the left one, Francis is showing the love that's experienced from the Virgin Mary. And on the right, he's showing the image of Jesus washing the feet of Peter and Francis. Indeed, coming along and imitating that in a way he could. And so the encounter with lepers changed everything. And in some ways, it really wasn't hard to leave the world. He was out walking around one day, and there was a church that had been damaged. And he walked in to pray, and he knelt before a crucifix, and he experienced the voice of Jesus saying, Francis, go and repair my church, which you can see is seriously damaged. There's the painting of it. This painting is actually in the church where Francis is buried. And if you don't recognize the cross, maybe you'll recognize this better picture of it, because that cross still survives. And it now hangs in the church in Assisi, dedicated to a person we'll meet in a minute, St. Clare. So this was a cross that was new at the time. And therefore, this is the famous, we call it the San Damiano cross, that's the name of the church, that spoke to Francis. And this is taken from the 1973 movie, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, but this is what we need to imagine. Francis left that falling down church, you can see the cross hanging up there, and says, okay, I'm going to go repair the church. I'm going to get stones, I'm going to get mortar, I'm going to get bricks, and I'm going to repair that church. And he did. And he repaired two more. Now, let me tell you something about the children of merchants or knights, real or would-be. They don't work with their hands. This was a scandal to the family. This boy that was going to either A, inherit their business, or B, be a knight and raise the whole stature of the family, is now grubbing around asking people for stones and bricks and mortar and doing the work all by himself. And this came to a crisis. His father finally, out of patience with him, said, look, kid, I'm going to read you out of the family, and everything you have of mine, you give me back. And this is not done in somebody's office. This is done in the main square and in front of the bishop. You can see him standing on the right. So Francis starts giving back everything his dad owns. Pretty soon, that meant his cloak. It meant everything. Because everything that Francis was wearing belonged to his father. And ultimately, he stood there stark naked. I always imagine, in my own crazy historical theory, that when he got down to the underwear, Dad sort of whispered, you can keep the underwear, kid. But we don't know that ever happened. Francis is naked. You can see the bishop doesn't quite know what to do about this, other than put a cloak around him. And his father, the guy in yellow, well, he's ready to belt his kid. He's being held back from doing violence to his own son. And notice how the painter made this picture. It's also in the church where Francis is buried. On the left side are things ecclesiastical, and on the right side are things worldly. And Francis has moved from one side to the other. He has moved from that world of knights and merchants, and he has moved over to those who work directly, if you will, for God. And in case you're wondering whether this pleases God, look up at the top a little bit to the left of center. There's the hand of God coming down, clearly blessing this. We'll talk more about art tomorrow, including this painting. Now what? Well, Francis thought, I'm going to have to get something to wear. So he went to the bishop and said, I've got an idea. I want to wear this thing. He's sort of drawing this. It's not actually a piece of clothing, but he's sort of drawing it here. You can see with a stick. See what he's going to do. Just look at the shape of that. He's going to put on Christ. Okay? Because his cloak is in the shape of the cross. And so Francis is looking now in every possible way to do God's work, to try to follow Jesus, to try to, again, to put on Jesus, as this very literally shows. And this is a wonderful painting. Again, we'll talk more about paintings tomorrow, done about 20 years after Francis's death. And then Francis does a lot of strange things. Because who is this guy? He doesn't have any religious order. He doesn't have any rules to live by. He doesn't become a monk. For example, that would have been an option. But Francis begins to sort of walk around in that cloak he put on. And by the way, notice there's one other guy there. This is the weirdest part of all. Within 2 or 3 years, he's got about a dozen followers. Also, generally wealthy men from Assisi. In other words, what Francis does is initiate a kind of consciousness among a lot of other people saying, our society is kind of screwed up. And we can do more for it if we can radically remove ourselves from the normal day-to-day life of people. That doesn't mean merchants are evil. That doesn't mean knights are evil. It means that it gives us a different way of living in the world. If we can say, we're not putting on our merchant clothes, we're not putting on our armor, we're putting on Christ. What might that mean? Well, in the early years, nobody knew. But when Francis stripped himself naked that day, extraordinary thing happened because Francis looked up at the sky and said, up till now, I've called my father Pietro Bernardone. That was his dad's name. But now, I'm free to say that my Father is our Father who art in heaven. And it took this radical break with his family fully to grasp what Jesus was asking him when he said from the cross, go and rebuild my church. He's talking about more than bricks and mortar. This is a larger task to rebuild the church. And Francis preached. And in this painting by Giotto, famous Florentine painting, he's preaching to the birds, very famous story. You always see statues of Francis with birds on his shoulders. Why? Because, first of all, he doesn't speak bird. And we got to say that. But what Francis experienced when he was stripping himself naked was that once I'm naked and looking up to my Father, he said, I can now for the first time say in my life that my Father is our Father who art in heaven. And he's my Father because he made me. But wait a minute. There's some implications to saying that. That's easy. He also made everybody else. He also made animals and trees and rocks. God made everything. Well, if God made me and he's my Father, and God made a bird and he's the bird's father, what are the bird and I? Just do the logic. We're brother and sister. And so when Francis is preaching to the birds, he's preaching to his brothers and sisters. Now you say, what did he have to say to birds? Well, probably not very much. It would make a lot of sense to us. But one thing he probably did say is, birds, God made you to fly. So, fly. Do what God made you to do. Now, see, for birds, that's not very hard because they don't have free will. Imagine if you say to human beings, okay, go and do as God made you to do. That's a lot tougher. In other words, the sermon to the birds is exactly the same sermon he gives to people. Recognizing that different groups of his brothers and sisters are going to understand things in different ways. And you may know that he wrote this famous poem about brother sun and sister moon. This is the Italian version of it. I just put it up here, and it's, praise for the sun, frate sole, for example. Praise for the moon, my brother and sister. But as you keep reading it, it's a little bit more than that. He talks about the fact that I give thanks to my brother wind and all weather. He doesn't have just fair weather view of brothers and sisters. This is all weather. And then down below, where he added a piece just before he died, he said the most remarkable thing: praise to you, my Lord, for our sister bodily death. You even embrace sister death. That everything that is your brother and sister. Because everything that is because of God. Now, it's one thing to sing that in a song or say it to a group of birds. It's another thing to try to live your life if you really believe that. And that's what Francis tries to do. He knows he's going to fail. That's inevitable. He would be the first to tell you that. But can I try to live taking ultimately seriously the idea that that beautiful bird flying over and that worm crawling under my feet are both my brother or sister? Think how radical that is. Think of the implications of that in so many ways. Well, I want to tell you a story that's probably not historical. The earliest record we have is about 100 years after Francis died. It's the story of the Wolf of Gubbio. And I want to tell you how Francis comes to settle some pretty serious business if you really start out with the idea that we're all brothers and sisters. He goes to the town of Gubbio, which is over the mountain from Assisi, and he's told by the people of Gubbio that there is this wolf that's eating people. And it makes it impossible to get goods in and out of the city. Cities, again, manufacture things. They have to import food and so on and so forth. What are you going to do? Francis goes out to find out what to do. He finds the wolf. The first thing he says is, "Greetings, brother wolf." Now, for a wolf that's just been eating some of his fellow human beings, that may sound sort of wild. But if you believe this brother-sister stuff, that's brother wolf. So that's number one. The second thing is, and again, you have to remember this is more allegory than history. He says, "Wolf," I paraphrase, "why are you eating people?" And he learns that it's because all the food that wolves normally eat has disappeared. And he says to the wolf, "Come with me." He takes the wolf inside the city of Gubbio. And you can see with one hand, he's shaking the hand of the wolf, and then the other, he's shaking the hand of the mayor. He's bringing these enemies together and says, "Mayor, if you will provide some food for this wolf will stop eating people." He's not eating people because he just wants to chomp around on a citizen now and then. He's hungry. And he says to the wolf, "If they feed you, you got to stop eating people." Now, this is a story, again, that many people doubt happened, or at least it may be a very highly allegorized version. But a few years ago, a reliquary was found while archaeologists were digging around, and in it was a wolf of a skull, or skull of a wolf, get that wrong. Skull of a wolf, who knows? But at any rate, think about this as the way to bring peace in the world. Your enemy is also your brother. You got to find out what the cause of the problem is. Then you got to try to find a practical solution. And then you got to get all the parties to agree. Gosh, that sounds very good. It's not shouting at evil wolf. It's not the wolf running off to try not to eat the mayor. It's not that at all. So Francis, in his life, whether it's preaching to the birds or perhaps with some exaggeration, the story of the wolf of Gubbio, is saying, this is what I want to do. I want to live according to the principle that everything is my brother and sister. Again, what a wild idea that is. Well, after Francis got a few people to join him, people began to say, these are these weird guys. Only one of them was a priest, not Francis. He was never a priest. And they're sort of walking around, they're sort of living out at night, and they're, they find whatever it is they can eat, and they sing songs together, and they go out and try to help poor people. That's weird. And there were those who thought that this is a bunch of sort of crazy heretics. So Francis headed off to Rome with his 11 followers. Okay, count them up. And goes before Pope Innocent III and asked to found an order based on a rule that he had written, which was basically a collection of biblical phrases. This pope was the most powerful pope ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter. His name was Innocent III. He was the most powerful political man in Europe. He also called the most important doctrinal council of the Middle Ages, where, among other things, transubstantiation was defined. They're meeting in the Lateran Church, which was and still is the Cathedral of Rome. And the Pope said yes. Must have shocked a lot of old cardinals and stuff sitting around. But the Pope said yes. And so the Franciscan order was created. This took place around 1212 or 1213. Now let me talk about what is it Francis wants to fight. He knows the sociology of Europe. So one class are those who fight, the nobles. What is their great collective sin? The answer is pride, right? Because they strut around in their armor and all that sort of stuff. This is a piece of sculpture from the Cathedral of Chartres in France, cataloging all the vices. This is the vice of pride. It's a knight falling off his horse. So Francis wanted to be a knight. Now he becomes a knight of Christ, which means dealing with the chief sin of the people of the class he wanted to join. What's the main sin of merchants? He's one of those too, remember. This is a piece of sculpture from the facade of Amiens Cathedral in France, made just about the time Francis died. This is hell, and this is Hellmouth here. And this is eating up all the sinners. And I want you to notice this sinner in line. He's got a big bag hanging around his neck. He represents a merchant because, of course, he wants to take his money with him, even to the afterlife. So Francis came from a merchant family, but he understood that greed is the great sin of the merchants. And therefore, he and his brothers will have to practice strict poverty. So he now is a knight of Christ and a merchant of the gospel. But boy, has he changed the definitions. How different it was after he again looked up to the sky and said that my Father is our Father who art in heaven, therefore declaring himself one with all the rest of the things God made. So Francis's sort of weirdness, his thinking, his failures have led him to this. But there's also a kind of new, kind of informal social classes arising too, because it's during Francis's life the great universities of Europe are founded. The oldest one in Bologna in Italy and Paris, and then Oxford and others as well. And one of the things that meant, especially as it affected Francis, was that people are writing great big thick books of theology that only they can understand. Thomas Aquinas, who lived about 2 generations after Francis, for example, he died in his 50s. He'd already written 2,000 pages of theology. I wonder how many people who have PhDs in Thomas Aquinas have read it all. But at any rate, and therefore, because of the rise of universities, and if you know universities, I do, one of the things university professors like to do is argue and humiliate one another. Right? No, if you read my book, you'd have never said that. I actually heard that said at a conference once. So here we have the great theologians of the church gathered in Francis' lifetime at the Lateran, same place Francis received the rule approval, and they're going to define a number of Christian dogmas because there are heresies around. And they define them in a lot of very technical language. If you want to read something that's A, hard to read, and probably you don't find very interesting, go read the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council. And Francis knows this. Here's a drawing from a medieval manuscript of scholars arguing with one another. You can see they're making my point. Now, my first point is, my second point is, you know what this is like. You heard these folks in school, right? You know what we're like. And so Francis also realized that sort of the new problem that's coming along, it's not that dogma is wrongly defined or dogma isn't important. Francis accepted everything easily. But if you have to be an expert on dogma and understand all the details to be a good Christian, how many people can be good Christians? And so for him, for Francis, the world also needs simplicity. And so if you've bought the book, I'm not pushing this, I'm making a point here. If you bought my book, it's called Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty and Humility. And when I read it 30 years later, I thought, that's not a bad book, but I would have called it Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty, Humility, and Simplicity. Because for most Christians, they don't read Latin, let alone read theology written in Latin. Francis himself probably had no more than what we would call an 8th grade education. So for Francis, Christianity, the teachings of God, need to be available to everybody. And sometimes that works not just with simple language, but even simple gestures and actions. Tell you something else Francis did. He met a young woman from a wealthier family than his own named Claire. This is a painting of 8 stories from Claire's life. And she basically wanted to sort of imitate Francis. Guys, this girl thing hadn't come up in their discussions. Because if you live in a religious order, men and women are separated, whether that's Benedictine brothers and Benedictine sisters or whatever it is. But the story of Francis and Claire taking on as much of the Franciscan teaching as possible, recognizing there were gender differences that couldn't be crossed in those days, an extraordinary thing happened because one night, I'm going to show you a picture of this particular scene. Okay? One night, Claire escaped from her family and went to meet Francis, and Francis cut her hair. That means she can't be married. He's taken a valuable prize away from his family because to cut the hair is to sever the possibility of marriage. He put her in a convent for a few days. I don't think the sisters liked it, neither did she. Finally, he set up a group of Franciscan sisters because she had followers very quickly, and they lived in Assisi too. Claire died about 20 years after Francis and also one of the great saints of the church. So this movement expands again to include women. I want to show you one miracle that's attributed to Claire. It's sort of interesting because there were actually Muslim mercenary soldiers fighting at the time that Claire was in this place with her sisters. And the story is that the soldiers come to attack, and Claire comes out, and she holds up the consecrated host in the pnyx, right here. And you can see what's happening. They're literally falling off the roof. It's one of her very famous miracles. But Claire is one of the great saints of the church, too, the first female Franciscan saint. And just like a lot of places in California get named for male Franciscan saints, like San Francisco, that would come to mind, or San Antonio, or San Diego, or whatever, there's also a Santa Clara in California, I'm happy to report. Well, as I said, Francis was a preacher. He preached to local people. This is him in a pulpit of a church in Pistoia, not far from Florence, painted about 30 years after he died. By the way, notice that in church, men and women sat separately. We know he preached to birds. He preached to the Pope. And this is a painting where I know it's hard to see, but down here, we know from the stories of this painting, he's preaching to heretics. He'll talk to anything, anyone, because heretics are our brothers and sisters. They may be fallen, they may be mistaken, but that doesn't mean they're not in the family anymore of God's creatures. And so preaching became the main job of the Franciscans. Oh, he also preached to Muslims. This is him preaching to the Sultan in Egypt. Francis got around for a guy that didn't have a car. And here he is preaching, and there's the Sultan, and there are all these other Muslims, and Francis has a scripture in front of him. And notice they're all paying attention, and the Sultan sort of seems to be sort of holding his heart. Well, because this is the era of the Crusades, a lot of people were not happy about this kind of relationship. And so even a few years later, you get this paintings of the same story, but here Francis says, I'm going to show you these guys are wrong. I'm going to build a fire. I'm going to walk in it. Then those guys are going to walk in it. So Francis is ready to walk in, and the Sultan is telling his guys to walk in, and of course they run away. That never happened. But one of the problems is the story of Francis preaching to the Sultan didn't fit the crusade narrative of the time, and so it had to be altered. Another reason we have to be careful listening to the stories we hear to see if we have some corroborating evidence. But I'm happy to report this has been fixed in modern times. This is a modern painting of Francis and the Sultan embracing, and it is part of an African organization in which Muslims and Christians start out working together to get very simple things done. Clean water in a slum. And then, when they've worked together and come to understand and trust each other, then they are able to talk about religion and disagree without being disagreeable. Because just like Francis talked to the wolf, and once you talk to the wolf and bring the wolf to you get the picture. So at any rate, this is an organization called the Damietta Project, because Damietta is the place in Egypt where Francis and the Sultan met. When I was in Kenya a few years ago, they asked me to speak at one of their meetings. It was one of the great glories of my life to be in this room where people who are dressed in ways they're of different religions are all getting along. And at the end, instead of applauding or whatever, they went, shh. I didn't know what that meant. Somebody called me over and said, they don't even want the violence of the hands hitting. They want to find a purer way of applauding than doing it by beating your hands together. And I thought, this works. And so Francis and the Sultan still work for us, still working today in Africa as a way of helping to bring Christians and Muslims together. Now, in 1223, Francis was 3 years away from his death, although, of course, he didn't know that. He went to a cave in a remote part of Umbria, and there, what he did was bring in a live ox and a live ass. And he put an empty manger. And this is that place. Here are some paintings of it. I want to show you the next picture. Let me lean over here to do that. Here we see the Pope in that place, Pope Francis. And so this is called the Christmas Cribigreccio. And let's talk about simplicity. Here's what Francis believed. If God becomes human, God can do that any way God wants. God can be born in a big palace. God can be a human in super muscles, and he also could come as an adult, right? God has all the choices in the world. When he became human, he chose to become human in a place with dirty, smelly animals and spend his first night, manger is such a nice word, in an animal feeding trough. And I think for Francis, what he would say is, if you can experience this and understand it, you have a 2-hour mass there, you know what those animals are going to do. This is no secret. And that's exactly what Francis wanted. Animals be animals, just like birds be birds. And so he tries to show the world in this little place that God came in the most humble way possible. You want to counter any kind of sin of humility, which is, after all, the first sin, is pride in the Garden of Eden, right? Eat this and you will be like gods. It's pretty tempting. And look what he's doing here. Down here with smelly animals, and Francis has a vision during the Mass of a baby Jesus in that crib. And you know today that we duplicate over and over, and sometimes they have outside setups of this where they actually bring real animals. But the point is, this was at a Mass, a Christmas Mass, and it was smelly, and it was dirty, and it was disordered. And I think what Francis was saying to the world, we sort of make it a little bit neater than it certainly was, is if this is what God chose, what does that tell us? Simplicity. No fancy things, no trumpets blowing, none of that stuff. It's about simplicity. So we can see in all the ways in his life and in his actions, he's responded to the sin of pride, the sin of avarice, because he's absolutely poor. The friars are not allowed even to touch money. And, of course, the sin of sort of this academic pride, this sort of, I know more than you do. God likes me more because I can say more things in more complicated Latin. Francis didn't write books about any of these things. He lived these things. And his life is an extraordinarily articulate story of what he wants to say in his own time, responding to particular needs in the 13th century. If Francis had come 5 centuries later, he would have probably chosen a very different path. If he came today, now, we don't know what he would do or what he would emphasize. But at least we have these lessons from him. This is the way, by the way, later on they depicted the Christmas Cribigreccio, because churches would imitate it. And so if you depicted in your art a cave and everything, people wouldn't know quite what that is. So this is a painting of the Christmas Cribigreccio. There's Francis, there's the image of the Christ he had, and we're behind an altar screen, and there's a crucifix, and there's a pulpit. We see all of this because when people, after the time of Francis, experienced the commemoration of this, they experienced in their churches. And if you made it out in the middle of nowhere, people wouldn't understand what the art was depicting. So what this art wants to do is say, I want to pick up this story of Francis, but I got to show you what it looks like today. And we tend to say, oh gosh, they just blew the history. They didn't get it right at all. They didn't even seem to care. And this was the point. This is a pretty wild-looking place still in southern Tuscany. It's called La Verna. There wasn't much there except rocks in Francis's day. And toward the end of his life, Francis went up to La Verna to pray. And on the feast of Michael the Archangel, he had a vision. And he received the wounds of Christ, what we call the stigmata. This is the earliest painting of that, done only 10 years after Francis died. It's not a picture of what happened. So we need to be aware of that. But here we see Francis kneeling in the rocks. These buildings were built later. And you can see what appears is actually a seraph coming from heaven, six-winged angel that brings the wounds of Christ, to Francis's hands and feet. I'm going to show you a series of these because 10 years later, when this was painted, there needed to be some clarification. Here you see, this is Christ sort of looking like a seraph. Christ's face is red, and you can see these beams coming down, transferring the images of the wounds into Francis's body. You can see them in the feet and the hands. And if we keep going, this is one that's done in Siena. And again, we have the wings of the seraph. We also have this cave down here with a bear. Nothing written about that. But one of the Old Testament prophets, Elijah, lived on a mountain in a cave where there was a bear. And so as Elijah lived and went up by himself in the mountains and had his own experiences of God, this is sort of saying Francis is kind of a new Elijah, which doesn't just mean a new guy out in the wilderness. It means a new prophet. And so this says a lot. This is maybe the most famous one. This is one in Assisi. And you can very clearly see now that Christ is the figure, even with the Italian blonde Christ there, with the wings. And you can see that Francis is receiving, in fact, the 5 wounds. And to make sure you get it, you can see the artist has drawn lines from the wounds of Christ to the wounds in the feet, the hands, and the side. So this is a more articulated way of telling the same story because we're now 100 years after it happened. And then this is Giotto's famous piece. This is actually in the Louvre in Paris. And what it wants to do is lead up to this. So we not only have a very clear picture of the stigmatization here, but we have Francis holding up the church, the Catholic Church. We have Francis with the Pope. We have Francis preaching to the birds. So the people who see this picture also get a little lesson of the stories leading up to it. Again, I'm going to talk about this kind of art more tomorrow. And this is Giotto's just now in Florence. And I want you to see a really interesting thing this artist has done to tell us something. There's that cave again. But look at the wounds coming from Christ. If you see, a seraph has 6 wings. So there are 2. There are 2. The other 2 are here. And they're open, but we can't see between them. But Francis can, given where he's located. And so this tries to give us more of the unique experience that Francis had. We can look at a lot of this, but we'll never quite get it all. We'll never understand it all, that Francis was uniquely Christ-like and therefore worthy to receive the 5 wounds of Christ. It's a really quite beautiful painting. Here's another one. This is in Assisi. And I just want to show you some of these to give you ideas of how this image looks. Now, Francis rebuilt a little church called the Church of the Angels, as in the Spanish Los Angeles. That's where the name comes from. And this is a church that Francis helped to rebuild, and this is where he died. Right now, it's inside a great big church, as you can see. But that's obviously centuries later. That little church was sitting out. And it was there that Francis died on the evening of the 3rd, which for us is the morning of the 4th of October. And here we see the earliest depiction of his body being laid out. So you see up above his spirit going to heaven, and down below, people who already recognize he's going to heaven are there asking for intercession. You can see them there kneeling. And here we have another one where you can see Francis's soul being taken more clearly up to heaven. But this is the last picture. This is not great art. But, sometimes a saint like Francis can scandalize people in ways they don't want to quite recognize. It's not that he's ahead of his times. He just has more vision and understanding. Now, Francis died among friars. But there's a story that circulated not long after his death that there was also a widow in Rome whom he had met. And she had helped him, and she venerated him, and that he had written to her saying, I'm about to die. Can you come and bring me a burial shawl? And so in this very modern picture, as you can see, it's not just friars, it's also this widow. And so it reminds us, even if it took to the 20th century to get this art, he's a very inclusive saint. And that whether she was there historically or not, we don't know, although I think the odds are yes. But it reminds us that even though he lived in an enclosed, kind of quasi-monastic community, he was there for everybody. Because all those brothers are his brothers, and this widow in Rome, of course, is his sister. And you don't just say, sister, you can't come to see me at this time. And so I hope partly through art and partly through some history, we've been able to get a good understanding of who this man was and why he's such an essentially important saint, maybe in the 21st century more than any other time since he died in 1226. Because we know the exclusion that so many of us, and I mean us, not just them, whoever them are, sort of want to leave certain people out of the picture. Or they're embarrassed by certain kinds of events and activities and people who don't seem to sort of measure up. And Francis was the most open, inclusive, because everyone is his brother or sister. That revelation he had when he stripped naked in Assisi became the guiding point of his life. Everything followed from that understanding. And my guess is if Francis walked in the back door, which this is not a setup, he's not going to do it. But if Francis walked in the back door, he said, I hope at least you learned that tonight. So as someone who studies him 800 years later, I hope at least you learned that tonight. Thank you. So now I've been told by the people in charge that we have a few minutes of questions, and because my hearing isn't very good, if I see a hand go up, I'm going to move your way so I can be sure to hear it. So who has any question, any kind of questions, from simply, a historical fact you want to something of more of interpretation? Ask away. Oh, you've got a microphone. I don't have to move then. Gosh, this will be easy.
I just wondered, the prayer of St. Francis, did he write that, or did someone write that about him?
Okay, start looking disappointed now. No. But, there's a but. That prayer was written in the 20th century. It was written in Belgium by a priest as World War II was beginning. And so it begins, of course, make me an instrument of your peace. So this is someone who took how we understand Francis, which I think was very well, and made it into this poem at a time when the world was literally going to war. So I think if we think of it in that context, we should not be disappointed that it didn't get written by Francis himself, but rather that we should rejoice that in the 20th century, someone in a very different world from his saw how to articulate his vision. And we know how powerful that prayer is. And I'm sure everybody here said it and sung it 100 times. So the answer is no, but that's not bad news. The good news is what it is and how I think authentic it is in the friar who wrote it. It actually first appeared in a Belgian magazine just after World War I began.
At what point in your life did St. Francis captivate you, where you wanted to learn more about him?
Well, I'm a medieval historian, so you have to know something. That's sort of the rule, because he obviously is an important chapter in medieval history. And I'd not really read anything medieval about him until I got to graduate school. And we read the authorized life of St. Francis, which was written by St. Bonaventure about 30 years after Francis died. And I thought, this guy's nuts, which shows you how well I did. Nevertheless, as a person who taught medieval history, I had to teach him and give him his due, as you would anybody. And I had done my research for my doctorate primarily in Czechoslovakia. This is 1968 and 9, the year of the Soviet invasion. Because I was working on a theologian from England who had moved to Prague for 40 years and associated himself with the teachings of John Huss. And I'd gone back a couple times, but it was really hard to operate in Czechoslovakia after the Soviet invasion. And so I simply said, I can't do it here. I just can't come back here and do the research. There's so many barriers to doing it. So I said, I'm a church historian. I want to find a new topic. Where should I go? Italy came to mind. Food's good. And I was traveling around, and I went to Assisi for a couple of days. I'd been there before. And this time it was just different. And as I walk in the Basilica, the place where Francis was born, which is a 2-level church, in the upper part are 28 stories from the life of St. Francis. Some of the ones I showed you are from that sequence, and I'll talk more about it tomorrow. And I'm in Assisi, and this guy's beginning to make sense to me in a way he never had before. So I found a bookseller that had a used copy of St. Bonaventure's Life of Francis in English. I didn't want to struggle with the Latin. And I realized that all the paintings that are in this church are from Bonaventure, but Bonaventure had hundreds of stories about Francis. What was special about these in the mind of the people who commissioned the painting and the people who did it? And I decided I wanted to find that out, and I've been working on it ever since. I got this crazy idea that I wanted to have a catalog of all the early paintings of St. Francis, so we can see all the different ways he was presented to different audiences, not just in Franciscan churches, but primarily. I started out with a list of 96, and 25 years later, I had 205, which I said, I got to write this book. And I did. It's a book nobody ever reads. I mean, it's not meant to be read. It's meant to be, referred to because it's a catalog. But the more you get to know the painting and see the different theological, not just artistic strategies of the painters and their sponsors, all that gives you so many ways of looking at St. Francis. So he became a much more multifaceted guy, not just a guy who stripped naked and got the stigmata and visited the Pope and a couple other things, but all the nuances of his life became interesting to me because no place depicted all the stories in Bonaventure's life. Some did it in 4. The ones in Assisi are 28, the most of any place. But even 28 is not very many out of 150. Why pick those? And how did that artist and how did that patron think that told a coherent story about Francis? And no 2 coherent stories are alike. So I've been doing that ever since. So it was actually being in the presence of the art as well as the city that helped me to do that.
That's why tomorrow when you hear about the art, it's going to be really intriguing. Other questions?
Your last painting shows Signora Settisoli, who was who was very close to St. Francis. How did you come to include her and this painting in your presentation?
Well, one of the things we know, just looking at the age of St. Francis, for example, is that Francis really did sort of help get the Clares going, a sort of female part. He knew they couldn't be because of church law, exactly like the friars. But he was very open to an idea of women living out the Franciscan charism, even though in a somewhat different way. And then, although I didn't talk about it tonight, he also started what we call the Third Order. And there are many Third Order chapters still around, men and women who live secular lives. They're married and have kids and are CEOs of companies and are poor people and everything in between. So that there's this sort of universal appeal of Francis. And so a lot of the art in the 13th century, shall we say, the patrons, and the artist doesn't make choice of what stories are told. So it's really the patron. The patrons are probably not that open-minded. They probably are more conventional and following cultural conventions. So even in the frescoes at Assisi, when Francis is preaching, he's preaching to a bunch of guys. And so I think since we have a pretty good idea, A, about Claire, and B, about the sister you're talking about from Rome, it's important that I included that, even if it sort of breaks my medieval scheme here, because we don't want to be limited by the way medieval people saw Francis through their own, like ours, eyes, which start with certain premises, and those premises change over time. So I wanted to be sure not to, A, to include Claire, but also to include a laywoman, a widow. And this, I mean, that would have been impossible to do in the 14th century. The only women you see near Francis are either somebody she's performing a miracle to or somebody who's in a habit, somebody who's a member of a religious order. But I think that narrows Francis too much. After all, you can imagine Francis is, for a lot of people, a pretty radical guy in the 13th century. I mean, heck, he's a pretty radical guy for us in the 21st, in some ways. And so the art, which is all sort of officially sponsored, and it's inside churches, it's not in somebody's living room. So it had to more conform to the standard views of the day than Francis probably ever did.
I think we have time for one more question.
I've got a question about the flowers of St. Francis, which are the tails.
The little flowers.
And the little flowers. And are those taken from Bonaventure? Or is Bonaventure considered like the essential biographer of? And I have another question for you. Are you a Franciscan tertiary?
I'm not. We tried to organize an organization once in my community. We're such a small town, and it's so isolated. Oh, am I losing my microphone here? I just wasn't able to do it. I'm there in spirit. But the Little Flowers of St. Francis, called the Fioretti in Italian, is a collection of stories made about Francis's life in the 14th century, about 100 years after he died. And it's a wonderful collection. And we don't know who the author is, but clearly he had a lot of sources that we have. He clearly had some sources we don't have. And he also perhaps still had some oral tradition that had been passed down that weren't written. And so his was not to give a life, a vita. You know, Francis was born here, he dies here, he's, so on and so forth, but just to bring together what the word means, a little bouquet of flowers. And so if we treat it as a life, as a story of Francis's life, it's hard to do. It doesn't go in chronological order. It doesn't go in any sort of obvious theme. But if we treat it as a bouquet of flowers, you can open it to any page and find a really edifying story. So some of those stories are regarded as probably later exaggerations or even stories that we can't trace back to historical sources. That doesn't mean that they didn't happen. It means we can't prove they happened. And historians tend to be skeptics when there are no written sources. But at any rate, it is and if you don't want to read a narrative, but just get a collection of stories about Francis and his life and to get a sense of who he is, the Fioretti, the Little Flowers of St. Francis, is a very, very good choice.
Okay, how about a big hand for Bill?
This is fun. Thank you.
Father, will you lead us in prayer? And also, we neglected to think about coat racks. So I suggest you just leave your coat in the pews and come back up after and get it.
So we'll say a quick prayer blessing for the food. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Benedicici, o Signore, e questo cibo che stiamo per prendere, nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Thank you.
Right. Right, and it's not a story, it's a vision. That Francis is there absolutely. We have got the word. He is reaching out to Christ because he can Christ like. And so he's